Good afternoon, my name is Isaac Holmes-Gentle. I'm from the Laboratory of Renewable Energy Science and Engineering here at EPFL, and today I will be discussing developing a unifying device classification system for a solar fuels database. So firstly, solar fuels is an ever-expanding field, and in order to limit the scope of this work to something manageable, we'll focus on a subset of solar fuels, notably photoelectrochemical water splitting, or PV+EC hydrogen production. Furthermore, only experimental demonstrations of complete devices are considered. That is, single photo electrode material studies or estimates of predicted solar to hydrogen efficiency are explicitly excluded. So in order to get a feel and demonstrate the magnitude of literature available, I did a quick search of the Web of Science core collection with the search terms such as photoelectrochemical and water splitting or solar fuels. And this quickly led to 7,000 papers. In order to make sure that this increase wasn't just due to an increase in the rate of publishing, I normalized it against the total and estimated estimate of the total number of papers published each year. And you can see that since 2010, photoelectrochemical water splitting really took off. And so for me, this number of reports in the literature constitutes an informational overload. In the PV community, the progress in the field is very well reviewed. So for example, we have the yearly Martin Green solar cell efficiency tables or the NREL efficiency chart. But in comparison to the photoelectrochemical research, you could argue that PV research into photovoltaics is at a far more advanced stage of development and is less complex, has a less complex device structure when compared to solar fuels research. But there have been a number of reviews in photoelectrochemical systems, such as the one by Rohn, by Ager, and from our lab, which was published as a website called SpecDC. And in each of these different systems, they categorized it in slightly different ways, but notably always categorizing it based on the material. And that leads me to say there are lots of different ways of characterizing these systems. So you could characterize them based on the construction of the electrode or the electrode wiring, whether it was wired or wireless, how the electrodes are physically placed in the cell, the optical design of the reactor, whether there's two windows, whether there's one. You could have some sort of degree of integration, like the Yakosum described in his paper in 2014. You could classify it by the kinds of materials used, whether they're expensive 3,5 semiconductors or inexpensive metal oxide. And you could also categorize it based on this nice taxonomy from Nylander in the group of Nathan Lewis, where they came up with a list of terms to classify these different systems. So can we represent the complexity of design within one single classification system? And so that's what I'm going to attempt to do here with this unified device classification system. And the requirements for this is it must be simple, but it also must have the ability to be descriptively complete. It also must be backwards compatible, so any of the aforementioned classification systems should be derivable. So firstly, we took inspiration from equivalent electronic circuits and process engineering, where they split things up into unit operations, and also from the Ager review paper, where they came up with these nice figures to demonstrate the architecture of the device. So we split up the system into a number of subcomponents such as the sunlight or simulated sunlight, the optical components of the system, the photoanode or photocathode, or the dark anode or dark cathode, or the photojunction, or the electrolyte. And all of these different subcomponents are represented in this graphical figure on the right. So in order to connect together subcomponents, we need to consider the transfer of the physical entities through the system. And we considered 3 physical entities. Firstly, the charge, the electrons, and the ions going through the system. Secondly, the light, photons going through the system. And thirdly, the chemical species, such as the products and reactants. So how does each of these entities see the device, see the cell? So for an example PEC device, which is illuminated by simulated sunlight through a quartz optical window onto a photoanode made of 2 junctions where one is a buried solid-state homojunction and the other is a semiconductor electrolyte junction on a conductive layer, connected to, say, a platinum cathode, which is externally wired, and there is an alkaline electrolyte. So firstly, the charge passes through the system and the subcomponents as follows, and you can make the nice electrical diagram on the bottom right there. The light is connected as follows, where the light passes through the optical window, through the electrolyte, onto the semiconductor electrolyte junction and onto the photojunction. And the nice thing about these directed graphs is that for the optical and electrical configurations, they can be stored in the form of an adjacency matrix, which can be stored in a database. Then, things like device configuration or performance metrics can be stored as attributes at either the device level or the subcomponent level. And this is really important for the machine readability of the database, because we can attribute things like composition to electrolytes, or materials to photoanodes or photojunctions, or areas. And in terms of device level attributes, we have things like the solar to hydrogen efficiency, or maybe the total experimental time that the system was run for. So on to our preliminary review. The size of the dataset is currently 60 devices taken from 40 papers in peer-reviewed journals, but it's important to say that the data is currently incomplete, and therefore the ability to draw any conclusions or uncover trends is currently limited. But this is to demonstrate the versatility of this aforementioned classification structure, particularly the filterability. So for the solar to hydrogen efficiency versus the year published in the graph below, we can filter this data set very quickly based on the Nylander taxonomy. We can also filter the data based on whether the electrolyte itself is acidic, alkaline, or neutral by some logic equation applied to the electrolyte pH. We can also create new graphs that I believe haven't been seen in literature before, such as the solar to hydrogen efficiency versus the ratio of the number of photojunctions to electrochemical cells. And you can see that for the majority of devices, they require 2 photojunctions to every single electrochemical cell, because a single photojunction doesn't produce the potential energy required to drive water splitting. In this preliminary review, we also noticed a couple of things, but not many devices included membranes at this stage. And in order to move to scaled water splitting devices, more studies must include a membrane or some sort of product separation method. Also, interestingly, the number of reports were missing the illuminated area and sometimes the electrode area if it was separate. This is really important to report because the current density should be assessed within the context of the total current. We need to know the total power in order to make a good assessment of how far away from thermodynamic equilibrium you are. You need to consider the total power of the system and the total amount of hydrogen produced. And finally, we took all of the reported performance data from the studies and we normalized them. And you can see that there's a multitude of different phenomena going on. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases, sometimes the experimental conditions are not consistent, sometimes bubbles are removed, causing oscillatory behavior. And so this really demonstrates that a single descriptive statement to do with degradation isn't good enough. So, for example, saying 10% degradation after a certain number of hours might not capture the complexity of the behavior over long time periods. And so with that, I'd like to conclude and say we've devised a classification system that permits meta-study analysis. All previously discussed classification systems can be easily determined, and the utility of this classification system has been demonstrated. In future, we want to expand the number of database entries, and once complete, we intend to release this work as the Solar Fuels database, which will be an openly accessible database, which allows for community submission. And with that, I'd like to thank my group and particularly the funding body, which was the EPFL Open Science Fund. Thanks for your time and any questions.